everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 of His Dark Materials season 3, Lyra and Her Death. I have my little demon Ori here with me, and I am stoked to talk about this episode. So much happens, so much going on, and so many bangers from Mrs. Coulter. She's got some great lines in this episode, specifically around her time with the Magisterium. So let's get into it. Gird your loins, folks. This is going to be a long-ass episode. To really kick things off, Mrs. Coulter arrives in Geneva at Magisterium headquarters, unknowingly bringing Lord Roke along for the ride with her. When she arrives, she commands everyone's attention, as she is one of probably very few women on the scene, and she demands that she be taken to Father MacPhail immediately. Most unfortunately for him, Father Gomez is the one that Mrs. Coulter is greeted by when she arrives at the Magisterium. Of course, the last time they saw each other, she bludgeoned him with a rock and he sustained quite an injury, but she's hoping this is water under the bridge. Father Gomez takes some time to alert Mrs. Coulter to the fact that Hugh MacPhail is no longer going by Father MacPhail. He will now be called Father President. And when they finally arrive at Father President's office, Mrs. Coulter says, "It's me, Hugh, or do you only answer to Father President now?" Mrs. Coulter has such a beautiful and powerful way of undermining other people's authority. She really knows how to insert herself in a position of power when she really has very, very few chips to bargain. Once Mrs. Coulter enters Father MacPhail's office space, let's call it, Father Gomez is quite interested in what's about to happen, and he lingers hoping that he gets to stay. It's Mrs. Coulter herself who notices this, and she very rudely says, "Is the boy staying?" This is such a slap in the face, but it's so well executed. Father MacPhail seems, perhaps in equal measure, excited and horrified to see Mrs. Coulter again. He is intrigued by her, and let's be honest, he's probably a little bit aroused by her. They spend their early conversation accusing each other of mutual betrayal, talking about all the things they've done wrong, all of their moral and religious failings, and Mrs. Coulter notes that she was really doing her best with Lyra. Mrs. Coulter clarifies that Eve didn't bring sin into the world when she was born. Eve was tempted by a serpent, and she was doing her damnedest to prevent the temptation and the subsequent fall, which was responsible for sin. Lyra on her own is just an innocent girl and is not guilty of doing anything wrong at this point. Mrs. Coulter also shares some very limited intel on Asa Hetra, Will's knife, with Father MacPhail, and then of course she takes great pride in telling him that she's responsible for breaking it. So this authority-destroying knife is no longer a danger to the world. She adds, probably for some controversy and to scare the life out of him, that Azrael has been murdering angels and is definitely a threat to be reckoned with. This is when Mrs. Coulter really turns the heat up a notch, capitalizing on the sexual tension that she has cultivated between herself and Father MacPhail, and she tells him that he has her body, mind, and soul. This comment from Mrs. Coulter really made me think about her character a bit zoomed out. We know that Mrs. Coulter is a fiercely intelligent person. She is an incredibly capable, kind of groundbreaking, innovative scientist. We also know that she has faith and kind of career savvy that has led her to this point, to this higher ranking or previous ranking in the Magisterium. She is also a woman who uses her sexuality quite a bit, and it feels like she has to. And I think that's what she points to, that she's not only a mind and a soul, but she's also a body. And it kind of goes back to her predicament with Lord Azrael that she spoke about. She is scorned as a woman who's used her flesh, but people don't recognize her for her other talents. And she's largely seen as this powerful woman of sex and sensuality and danger, when her real danger lies elsewhere. In her reminiscence about Cardinal Sturrock, she tells Father MacPhail that by contrast, his abstinence is magnificent. This was a surprise of a line. It kind of indicated what I think we might have all suspected last season, that Mrs. Coulter and Cardinal Sturrock had perhaps a sexual relationship. But Father MacPhail is not bending to the pleasures of the flesh. At the same time, she vaguely threatens him with the reminder that they were both in on the murder/negligent death of Cardinal Sturrock, who was the leader of the magisterium before Father MacPhail came to power. It was Rutascati who stabbed the cardinal on the boat after Mrs. Coulter had been torturing Katia the witch, and they could have gone to a doctor for help, but Mrs. Coulter convinced Father MacPhail instead to just let the cardinal die and see what happened. So they both have this secret. They're both very tightly bound to one another with this very treacherous secret. She says, "Remember what we did together." But Father President is no longer a lowly cardinal. He's no longer a lowly priest, and he is liking the power that he has. And in a very, very weird but beautifully coordinated move on the part of the show, he puts some physical distance between himself and the very sexy Mrs. Coulter by sticking out his fist like this to her face, and it almost looks like he's about to punch her, but he's not. He's actually gesturing to her that she should kiss his ring. And like Mrs. Coulter does for Cardinal Sturrock, she does end up kissing his ring, but she also grabs his wrist and pulls him a little bit closer to her. She is not the same Mrs. Coulter who has any pretense of submission to the church at this point. She really has her own agenda, and she's not shy about not wanting to give up the power that she herself has amassed. These two are definitely on much more equal footing than Father MacPhail would like to admit, and Mrs. Coulter is not going to let him forget about that. As delicious and nuanced a conversation as this was in the show, this conversation between Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail is possibly even better in the book, and I did want to spend some time reading some choice passages from the book that didn't quite make it into the show, because I think they add a new layer of context, of philosophy, of scorn that Philip Pullman has towards this whole religious thing, but they're just too good to go unsaid. So here we go. This is again when Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail are reunited for the first time since Mrs. Coulter went rogue and kidnapped Lyra and has been holding her in this cave. Mrs. Coulter says, "My daughter is now 12 years old. Very soon she will approach the cusp of adolescence, and then it will be too late for any of us to prevent the catastrophe. Nature and opportunity will come together like spark and tinder. Thanks to your intervention, that is now far more likely. I hope you're satisfied," Father MacPhail says. "It was your duty to bring her here into our care. Instead, you chose to skulk in a mountain cave, though how a woman of your intelligence hoped to remain hidden is a mystery to me." Mrs. Coulter. "There's probably a great deal that's mysterious to you, my Lord President, starting with the relations between a mother and her child. If you thought for one moment that I would release my daughter into the care of a body of men with a feverish obsession with sexuality, men with dirty fingernails reeking of ancient sweat, men whose furtive imaginations would crawl over her body like cockroaches. If you thought I would expose my child to that, my Lord President, you are more stupid than you take me for." I adore this passage, mostly because I think it's a really clear indicator of exactly what Philip Pullman thinks of so much of the church and the culture of having a bunch of supposedly celibate men together with the youth. I think Mrs. Coulter here is a great voice to all of the woes the church has had and what happens when you repress sexuality in grown-ass people. This meeting that Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail have after Mrs. Coulter going rogue is really interesting in how impassioned it is. Mrs. Coulter is playing such a fine line between giving herself back to the magisterium and also having some distance to criticize the magisterium. And she says this to Father MacPhail. I think it is such an eloquent, interesting, very heretical thing to say. "Well, where is God?" says Mrs. Coulter. "If he's alive." And why doesn't he speak anymore? At the beginning of the world, God walked in the garden and spoke with Adam and Eve. Then he began to withdraw, and he forbade Moses to look at his face. Later, in the time of Daniel, he was aged. He was the Ancient of Days. Where is he now? Is he still alive, at some inconceivable age, decrepit and demented, unable to think or act or speak, and unable to die? A rotten hulk? And if that is his condition, wouldn't it be the most merciful thing, the truest proof of our love for God, to seek him out and give him the gift of death? Mrs. Coulter has no fucks left to give at this point, and it's a thing of beauty to witness. The kids are now in the land of the dead, and I should have said this last time, apologies, but the land of the dead to me kind of looks like a cross between a classic depiction of the Elysian Fields and a fucking apocalyptic movie. It's like end of the world warehouse, abandoned buildings, refugee camp, plus overgrown, kind of vaguely golden plant life. Unclear. It is not a very pleasant place to be though, and it seems pretty devoid of anything warm, no pearly gates in sight. As Will and Lyra follow others down the road towards the central building, we hear Pan kind of squirming. He is very, very resistant to the journey that they are now taking, and he doesn't think that Lyra should continue. He realizes that all of the people around them don't have demons, even though some of those people do come from worlds where demons exist. So this is not a place for Pan. Eventually, the kids do get to the main building. They enter the space that almost looks like an airplane hangar, and there are these lines of people gradually moving forward. In the middle of this giant hangar type structure is a man who looks like he might be in a lifeguard tower, but he's inspecting everyone as they come through, making sure that people are in the right spot doing the right thing. The person in what I'll be calling the lifeguard tower spots Lyra and points to Lyra and Will, saying that they're in the wrong spot, and Lyra immediately goes into her mode of tell whatever story is going to get us out of this situation. So she tells the lifeguard something that they're lost, they followed some people, they're just trying to get to her friend Roger, and he calls her out immediately as a liar, saying that no, nice try, you can't be here, you should go to holding area 32. And she receives a paper from this guy that just has a 0 with a slash through it, and she's told that she and Will should go to this holding area 32 until they die, because that's what they're here to do. They do eventually make it to area 32. The person there redirects them to yet another holding area. So it's clear that they're not going anywhere soon, and they're certainly not going to be reunited with Roger unless they take matters into their own hands. Back at Magisterium headquarters, Father Gomez brings in a trunk to Mrs. Coulter's room and says that he has a gift for her. Mrs. Coulter recognizes the trunk as from her mother, and Father Gomez tells her that Mrs. Coulter's mom was only too happy to help them locate her when she was missing. This is kind of vague, brief foreshadowing to what we start to learn about Mrs. Coulter in the second book of the Book of Dust, The Secret Commonwealth. I'm very interested to see what this will tell us later. Mrs. Coulter notes to the golden monkey that Mother always had such grace, and she removes the clothing from this trunk, and we later see her put it on, but it's almost like armor to her. She has this facade of like a beautifully elegant, very chic styled woman who will use her femininity and her womanhood and the strength that she gets from that to really crush her enemies. I also thought this was an interesting parallel between Mrs. Coulter and Lyra, not only because at some point Mrs. Coulter stuck Lyra in a trunk, but because at the beginning of season 1, we see Mrs. Coulter dressing Lyra, getting her fitted for all of these bespoke dresses and letting her know that you can dress for power. So this was a nice allusion back to that. Mrs. Coulter had obviously been groomed by a mother like herself when she was a girl. At this point, Lord Roke, the stowaway, decides to announce himself to Mrs. Coulter, And it is clear to both of them that they need to start relying on one another if they're going to get out of this situation. He admits to Mrs. Coulter that the lodestone resonator, the device he uses to communicate with Azrael, has been damaged in them arriving in Geneva, and Mrs. Coulter is basically a prisoner at the Magisterium, so they'll need to collaborate on their escape. After we can assume hours of frustration, Lyra and Will are walking around this waiting area, and they finally approach someone, or someone approaches them, kind of, who seems vaguely friendly, as Lyra calls him, but who is willing to give them information about the land of the dead and how they can move forward with their journey. So this man takes them to yet another holding area, and along with an older woman, they tell Lyra and Will about death. Again, the setup in the book is a bit different, but the idea at its core is the same. The idea is that we are all born with our death, and our death follows us around every moment of our life until it is time for us to die. And when that moment comes, our death comes to us and says, with kindness and friendship, that they will lead us to the boat, the boatman, and from there into eternal death, I guess. In order for them to make it to the real land of the dead, the kids will need to invite their death, and death only comes when we are ready for it. I have to say, this idea of death meeting us with love and kindness really shaped me as a kid, and I think it was really positive for me. I almost died when I was quite little. I have a very serious heart condition, and I think perhaps because of that, I've always had a bit of a looser grasp on the idea of living, but this was such a gentle and respectful approach to our end of life that it really struck me as something I would want to believe in. Obviously, this is a novel, it's fiction, but I like the idea of almost like Yambe Aka, the witch's goddess of death, that we have a friend who will guide us out of our physical existence into what is beyond. It seems strange to say this, but we have such an urge to stay alive at whatever cost, to fight the idea of death, even if we remain quite sick for a long time, just to avoid it. And I think this is such an interesting contrasting approach, that we really can die, that it is okay, and that it can be a gentle and peaceful moment in our lives rather than something that we need to constantly fight against. So just wanted to point out that this is one of my favorite mechanisms in his Dark Materials, and I was glad that it showed up in the show as well. Back in Geneva, Mrs. Coulter puts on the dress that is in the trunk from her mother, and with that uniform, costume, armor, whatever you want to call it, on her, she bulldozes all in her path. She exits her room looking for the space that Lord Roke mentions to her Father Gomez has spent a lot of time in. And on her path to find this room, she unfortunately for him runs into another priest who asks what she's doing, reminds her that she's not allowed out of her room. And when Mrs. Coulter asks him, what are you going to do about it? He says, I will find support. And she sarcastically says, oh good, we all need support. It doesn't take her long to find the lab that Lord Roke has mentioned, and in that lab she does see Dr. Cooper. She immediately recognizes Dr. Cooper and simultaneously charms and slightly insults Dr. Cooper, as I think she calls her one of her castaways from Bolvangar. Most importantly, she ascertains that Dr. Cooper and her team are working on a device that harnesses the technology that they used at Bolvangar, that Mrs. Coulter herself designed, but they've made some modifications. And those modifications are that they're building a bomb. Shortly after this, the Magisterium catches up with Mrs. Coulter, and what look like Swiss guards pull Mrs. Coulter out of the lab, and she is now not to be treated as kindly as she was before. While Mrs. Coulter is sleeping in her room, Father Gomez sneaks in, and we see him hovering over her in bed, which is really fucking creepy. But rather than sexually assault her, thankfully, he instead takes a locket off her neck, and we come to understand that Mrs. Coulter has cut a lock of Lyra's hair and is storing that hair in the locket. Unfortunately, Mrs. Coulter has given the Magisterium the means to destroy Lyra. They will be using the hair in the locket to target the bomb that they've been working on. Lord Roke is not asleep when this happens, and he sees Father Gomez taking the hair and is able to intercept this. He grabs the hair that he sees and brings it back to Mrs. Coulter, and they decide that it would definitely be best to burn the hair so that the hair cannot be used in a bomb going forward. In the land of the dead, against Pan's most fervent wishes, Lyra does summon her death and leaves Will to talk to her death in private. She tells Death why she so desperately wants to go to the land of the dead and help Roger. And though Lyra's death is not extremely on board with this and wonders if this would violate any of the laws of life and death, eventually Lyra is able to cajole her death into going on this journey with her. Lyra's death is very clear about one thing though. She says that she can take Lyra to the boat and the boatman, but she cannot go beyond that, and she can certainly not lead Lyra back into life somehow. So Lyra can get in, but she has no idea how Lyra is going to get out. And somehow that's okay with Lyra. Lyra says that she is gonna make it work no matter the cost. We don't see Will's death at this point. Lyra's death agrees to guide them both, but I do wonder what Will's death would look like if we got to meet them. While Lyra is negotiating with her death mentions that she has been with Lyra the entire way. She's seen every choice that Lyra has made. She is her special friend, and Pan verbally disagrees with this. He takes offense to Lyra's death calling her Lyra's most special friend when Pan is clearly Lyra's most special friend. There's definitely some kind of weird competition between the two of them. After a great deal of travel using the I Ching and Sunburn, Mary finally makes it to her final destination. We can call it the Mulefa world, and she finally meets a Mulefa. And I was so delighted by how these creatures were brought onto the screen. I was very curious about them. I don't think they look exactly like how I pictured. Philip Pullman is very clear in the books that the Mulefa have a diamond-shaped frame and they don't have a single spine like most mammals in our world. They looked more like small elephants mixed with giraffes to me, and didn't have that diamond frame. They didn't use their seed pods in the way that I'd envisioned, but they were a delight to behold in any case, and I was not disappointed at the end of the day. So glad that Mary can finally get some rest. In Geneva, Mrs. Coulter and Lord Roke decide to make a run for the Intention Craft, realizing that things probably aren't going to get better and it's time to bounce. Unfortunately, they are intercepted by the might of the Magisterium. Not only Father MacPhail and Father Gomez, but all of the Magisterium soldiers seem to be in hot pursuit, and Mrs. Coulter and the Golden Monkey are cornered, not in a good spot. Mrs. Coulter has one last card up her sleeve, and she uses this very public moment to accuse Father MacPhail of collaborating with her on murdering Cardinal Sturrock. And she questions all of the priests, all of the fathers, the whole magisterium, about their interest in power over truth. Father MacPhail is not about to let Mrs. Coulter have this moment, so he asks the guards to silence her, and they literally shove their hands over her mouth so she can't speak. He calls her an incoherent, emotional woman and throws her in a cell. And I thought, of course, here is a man in power calling a woman emotional because that's all he has. I did want to note that when they do throw Mrs. Coulter into the cell, they separate Mrs. Coulter from her golden monkey demon. This would cause a normal person intolerable pain and suffering and agony, and I don't think that they know that Mrs. Coulter has the special ability to separate from her demon, so the Magisterium is definitely upping the ante in punishment. They also put her in a blue dress that immediately reminded me of the kids at Bolvangar. It has the same color, cut, style. I'm sure it's intentional. And this really shows us how desperate a situation Mrs. Coulter is in. This is the kind of thing that they put kids in before they sever them from their demons. So we're worried for Mrs. Coulter. She is not in a safe place. As promised, Lyra's death does lead Lyra, Will, and Pan to the ferry where the boatman will ostensibly take Lyra, Will, and Pan to the land of the dead. During this whole journey, Pan has become increasingly agitated. He is very distraught, very upset, asking Lyra to change course. She can make a different decision, but Lyra has really made up her mind and has decided that she will do whatever it takes to get to the land of the dead and to help Roger. When Lyra, Will, and Pan get to the ferryman actually tells Lyra and Will and Pan that one of their party is not suitable for travel at this time. Lyra's quite confused by this, but when she asks who that person is, thinking it must be Will, the ferryman says that it's Pan, that demons cannot cross the water, that there will not be a place for him on the boat, that if he gets on the boat cannot leave. This, of course, is not what Lyra had bargained for. She was very sure she could bring Pan. She even comments on how small he is. He doesn't take up any space. But the boatman is resolute. This is the law, and it's like gravity. It cannot be changed no matter how much pleading occurs, how many threats occur. At some point, Will actually takes out the knife, shows it to the ferryman in a bit of a threatening posture, and the ferryman says, "How many people do you think have tried this before? I can't do anything about it. Either you come and he stays, or the boat doesn't move at all." Lyra tells the boatman, "If we separate, we die." The boatman responds, "Isn't that what you want?" And that's really the moment when I think it hits the kids that what they're doing is akin to death, if not death itself. Will points out to the boatman how unfair this is because he believes he doesn't have a demon to leave behind, but the boatman corrects him and says that Lyra is just luckier or unluckier than Will in that she can see and talk to her demon. Everyone has a demon or a piece of themselves that doesn't come with them on this journey. Will just can't see his own in the same way that Lyra can. He will also be leaving something too. Pan and Lyra are pleading with each other. They're very, very upset, understandably. This is a heavy and sad moment. And when Pan asks again why she has to do this, Lyra tells Pan that she cannot betray Roger, which implies that she can betray Pan. She can betray a piece of herself. And honestly, it is devastating to watch. For me, it was one of the top 3 heartbreaking moments of the show. Eventually, Lyra gets on the boat, Pan stays on the dock, and we see Lyra just crushed by this. Pan is equally crushed by this, and it's really, really heart-wrenching to observe. Not gonna lie, I sobbed both times I watched this episode. The scene just devastated me, it wrecked me. It got me thinking about abandonment and how Lyra is abandoning Pan at this moment, how Lyra herself was abandoned by both of her parents, and wondering if this is the cycle repeating itself. Thinking along those lines, we also know that Mrs. Coulter has the power of separation from the Golden Monkey Demon, that she herself has gone through some form of this process, though ostensibly not in the land of the dead. But this is almost a ritual for both mother and daughter. We learn in the 2nd season, thanks to my namesake Dr. Lancelius, shout out to him, that the witches have their own ritual of separation from their demons, where they go to a place where demons cannot follow, and in that way they gain this power that doesn't sever them, but creates this distance and is extremely painful. So unbeknownst to her, Lyra is becoming a witch in this one way, also following the family path in another way, and still abandoning herself in the process. And that's where the episode leaves us, in shambles basically, completely emotionally distraught. But this has been a very full episode for both Lyra and Mrs. Coulter, and Mary finally, and we're halfway through the season, believe it or not. We are moving right along. Thank you again so much for joining me, and looking forward to talking about episode 5. See you soon.